Gabriel Attal warned that the election of several far-right French MEPs would be tantamount to France leaving Europe. With this, the French Prime Minister Gabriel Attal has warned people in France to not be like the British who cried over Brexit, and that just a few days before the European elections. The PM said that the election should not be seen as a referendum for or against the government, speaking in an interview with media, as a long list of MEPs from the far-right Rassemblement National party are on the voting sheet. Mr. Attal denounced the party formerly led by Marine Le Pen and now headed up by Jordan Bardella, and dismissed its claims that Emmanuel Macron has a hidden agenda. He also said that voting for RN MEPs would be tantamount to wanting France to leave Europe. He said the RN is doing everything to avoid talking about Europe in this election. Why? Because the reality is that their manifesto at European level would be tantamount to France leaving Europe. All those who claim that this election is a national issue are playing into the hands of the extremists, he says. The question being asked on June 9th is whether France will be the country that sends the largest number of far-right MEPs to the European Parliament. And he said that if this were to happen, European institutions could come to a standstill with very dangerous consequences. Europe is mortal, he warned. And Mr. Attal said he believed that leaving the EU would considerably weaken the country in many respects, and said that France would not be stronger if we turn on ourselves. We won't be stronger if we are more alone, he said. But I'm convinced that the French understand that. Mr. Attal said that the MEPs have a crucial job in defending France's interests in the important EU arena, including pushing for more investment to keep up with competition from the USA and China, a more effective immigration plan, and better policies for women and young people. The PM said that the MEP for the President Macron's Renaissance Party, pro-European Valérie Ayé, would focus on all of these topics and defend French interests. 4 years after leaving the EU, Great Britain is still struggling with the negative economic and political consequences. The Conservative government that pushed for Brexit is facing a heavy defeat in early elections in July, and this is one of the reasons why calls for leaving the Union have recently become much quieter in other EU member states. In Austria, a declared Exit party failed to gather the necessary numbers of declarations of support to run in the EU elections. Nevertheless, the FPÖ, for example, is openly toying with the idea of reversing EU integration. The Economic Research Institute, or WIFO, has for the first time produced a detailed study on the economic consequences of Austria's exit from the EU. The basis for this is simulations based on the Brexit treaties and an analysis how Austria has benefited from the opening up of the East, but also the internal market, the customs union, and participation in the euro and Schengen over the past 30 years, and what would happen if these. The results are dramatic. In terms of the economy as a whole, a collapse of the EU in Austria would reduce the real value of GDP by an average of around 7.8% in the long term, they say. In absolute terms, that would be 35 billion euros per year. The range of this loss of prosperity in the long term is in the order of 5.3 to 10.4% of total economic output, 24 to 47 billion euros measured in 22 prices. In Britain, it was only 3.2 to 6.7% of GDP. Per capita, every Austrian would suffer an economic loss of 3,860 euros, and that every year. And in the short term, a loss of 7,000 euros per capita is even to be expected. And the ratio, just to say it in 22, the GDP per capita in Austria was 49,400 euros. And to put it in a perspective, as a member, Austria is not a net contributor to the EU, paying more into the budget than it normally receives in subsidies each year. The net contribution per capita in 22 was between 130 and 184 euros, depending on the calculation method. The current net benefit of EU membership is around 3,700 euros per capita. So 30 times what they put in almost. And the authors of the study, the WIFO boss Gabriel Attal and Inga Heiland from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, point out that a surprise hard break between the EU and Austria would probably result in twice as much damage in the short term. And much would also depend on the terms of an EU withdrawal agreement, which would first have to be defined in negotiations. Small EU states naturally have a double disadvantage here. They benefit significantly more from EU membership and the internal market than the large flagships such as Great Britain in the past or Germany today, which would suffer greatly from a Brexit as well. In Luxembourg, for example, the per capita benefit of EU membership is between 16,650 and 27,150 euros. However, small countries find it more difficult to negotiate bilateral agreements with the EU and the rest of the world. And Austria is also particularly economically advantaged by its central location in the middle of Europe and its openness to many neighboring countries. According to the study, 3/4 of Austria's economic advantage comes from participation in the EU internal market. Also, the open borders and monetary union bring significantly smaller advantages in comparison. So the negative consequences of an exit that's described there are still the more favorable scenario for Felbermayr. Lower limits for the true costs. And this does not even include the non-quantifiable advantages of EU membership: innovation, freedom of citizens, profit from a common foreign and security policy, and so many more things. But it's also interesting to look at the future if Austria remains in the EU. There are still major barriers in the internal market, whether in energy, the capital market, or infrastructure projects. If these were removed and economic dynamism further boosted, Austria could benefit even further because this drives the overall economic performance of the state. The internal market is the EU's most important contribution to prosperity in Austria, is the opinion of Felbermayr and Professor Heiland. Or to look at it another way is the advantages of EU membership exceed the contribution to the EU budget by 10 times, and that's a lucrative business. A few days before the European elections, several trends are clearly emerging across the 27 EU states. Only a few topics dominate practically everywhere. First, how do you reconcile the economy and climate protection? Industry must be made afloat in a way that maintains prosperity and the welfare state but conserves resources. The pressure from climate change and all the damage it brings is high, and the change will cost a lot of money, both for the state and privately. And global competition is not sleeping here. And secondly, the war in Ukraine is weighing heavily on Europe, both economically and in terms of security. And psychologically, it's weighing on people's minds. Thirdly and finally, there is serious debate across the continent about whether democracy in Europe is in danger, whether the rule of law and fundamental rights are guaranteed. And this mix of topics shows why this EU election is more important and more fatal than all previous ones since the introduction of direct parliamentary elections in 1979. There have always been doubts and criticism, but suddenly it looks to many as if the peaceful, and not to say comfortable, course of the community could tip over. The phrase, "it's about the future," sounded like adjustment, like manageable reforms in previous elections. In 2024, it has a threatening undertone, as if the posters were saying, this time everything is at stake. In fact, the vehemence, fundamentality and breadth with which the existence of the EU is such as being questioned this time is a novelty. Whether the system, as right-wing populists say, should not be overturned completely. Whether the EU of corporations needs to be disposed of, as the left denounces. Such attacks are made for different reasons. It's no coincidence that an anti-capitalist youth movement that is concerned about the climate and the planet calls itself the last generation and enjoys a lot of sympathy. Young people are worried that the ecological turning point will be missed. But what is the realistic alternative? 27 states cannot be led without compromise. The right-wing populists, the extreme right, are completely different. They want to go back to the past. The Union, a community in an open European society, is to be replaced by nation-states. Those who denigrate the EU as a warmonger and put up the posters saying EU madness, like the Freedom Party in Austria, don't just want reform. The FPÖ and its right-wing extreme partners want to shoot the EU to pieces. And Matteo Salvini, Geert Wilders, Viktor Orban, and all the others. And in between the traditional parties, the Christian and Social Democrats, Liberals and Greens, they are trying to assert themselves as protectors. If you trust the election forecast, they are doing this with moderate success. But still, Liberals and Greens are likely to lose more seats than the two mainstream parties. Nevertheless, it looks as if the European Union will remain politically stable even after election day. The centre is likely to hold firm, strong enough to support a moderate program for the new EU Commission with a majority. In a working parliament like Strasbourg, brutal popular statements a la Harald Wilimski won't get you very far, despite gaining seats. And not with being gossipy either, as, for example, in Austria there's now someone called Lena Schilling, that's a Green Party member, and she's trying everything with that. Even saying something against her own party. But that was funny. It's a different topic for a different video. But it was funny to see on the news in recent weeks. Nevertheless, there is something else required in the EU Parliament. And fortunately, everything looks like that the reasonable parties will still hold a big majority there and will pave the way for the next years in the EU. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.